The night they laughed at me, something inside me went quiet but firm. I had spent all day preparing that dinner, believing for a moment that love was still enough. But when my daughter said those words, and they all laughed, I felt the warmth in the room turn cold. I didn't argue. I simply smiled, picked up my plate, and walked away. That was the moment everything changed. Thank you for being here with me today. It truly means a lot. And before I begin, I would love it if you tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Doris, and I live in Indiana, a quiet place that has held more of my memories than any person ever has. For years, I've built my life around the idea that family was a safe place, a warm corner of the world where laughter meant love and not cruelty. I never imagined that a table I set with my own hands, with a roast I cooked from scratch, could turn into the place where I'd be reminded just how far away love can drift when hearts harden. I've lived a long life, raised children, worked through storms, and held my ground when it felt like the world was determined to shake me. I've given, not because anyone demanded it, but because I believed kindness has a way of coming back home. For many years, that belief carried me through sleepless nights and quiet mornings, through birthdays and holidays where I smiled even when my heart felt tired. I used to think that the love I poured out would hold this family together like threads in an old quilt, strong and soft at the same time. But that night at the dinner table showed me something I wasn't ready to face. It wasn't just a careless laugh or a cruel sentence. It was the sound of the bonds I had trusted slowly snapping, one by one. And what hurt wasn't just her voice, but how natural it was for everyone else to follow along, like my absence had already been rehearsed long before I ever sat down. I didn't cry, but I felt something settle deep in my chest. Something cold and quiet, the kind of silence that changes a person forever. That silence is where this story begins. Not with a fight, but with the moment I finally stopped trying to prove I belonged. It was the moment I chose to stand on my own 2 feet, not waiting for someone else to remember what I had given. And as I sat alone later that night, I realized that sometimes it's not the shouting that breaks your heart. It's the laughter. I've always believed that if you give love, it will somehow find its way back to you. Maybe not in the same form, but in the quiet ways people show up for you when you need them most. That belief came from a lifetime of holding everything together with my own hands. I wasn't born with much, but I built something out of nothing. I worked long hours, sometimes coming home with aching feet and tired bones, but never once did I let that stop me from making sure my family had what they needed. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about little things that added up over the years, the kind of love you give without ever asking for applause. When my daughter was growing up, I gave her every ounce of strength I had, even when I had so little left for myself. I paid for school supplies when money was tight. I worked overtime when bills piled up, and when she cried at night, I was always there, even when my own heart was breaking quietly in the background. I believed that kind of love would build unshakable bonds, that no matter how the world turned, family would be the one thing that wouldn't break. But as the years passed, I started to notice the distance. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, quiet, like a candle burning lower each night. A missed call here, a cold tone there, little comments that carried weight. I told myself it was just life moving too fast, but deep down, I felt it. I felt the space between us growing, and I kept trying to fill it with kindness, hoping it would be enough. I gave and gave, thinking that one day she'd remember who always stood in her corner. I never wanted anything in return, not a single grand gesture, just respect, a little warmth, maybe a hug that didn't feel forced. But sitting at that table the other night, I realized that sometimes love isn't forgotten all at once. It's chipped away slowly, until what's left is just a memory you hold on to alone. That thought sat heavy in me, heavier than any burden I've ever carried. And for the first time, I wondered if I had spent years loving people who had long stopped looking back. That night, when I walked into the dining room, everything seemed warm and familiar. The kind of setting I used to dream about when I was younger. The table was covered with the old lace cloth I had kept for years. The roast sat in the center still steaming, and the soft light from the chandelier wrapped the room in a glow that made everything feel safe, or at least it pretended to. I watched their faces as they laughed among themselves, plates clinking, glasses being passed around, and for a moment I let myself believe we were still the same family we used to be. I sat down carefully, trying to quiet that small ache in my chest that had grown louder over the years. I smiled, not because I was truly happy, but because sometimes you smile to remind yourself that you're still strong enough to sit through the hurt. When I mentioned the family reunion, it wasn't meant to be anything more than a simple thought, a little hope I had carried quietly with me. I wanted to feel included, to believe that despite everything, my presence still meant something. But the moment my daughter laughed, it was like every piece of that hope cracked. Her words came out sharp, coated in the kind of cruelty that doesn't need to be shouted to leave a scar. And when everyone else joined in, their laughter didn't sound like a joke anymore. It sounded like a door slowly closing in my face, one I didn't even realize had been half shut for a long time. I kept my face steady because that's what I've always done. I didn't let them see the sting in my chest or the way my fingers tightened around the edge of my plate to keep them from trembling. I looked around the table, and what I saw wasn't a family I recognized. I saw strangers wearing the faces of people I loved. The warmth I used to feel in that room had turned thin. Fragile, like glass that could shatter with one more word. I remember taking one last bite, not because I was hungry, but because it was my way of holding on to the dignity I still had. I stood up slowly, pushing back my chair without a sound, and walked out without looking back at their faces. Not one person called after me, not one voice said my name. That silence told me everything I needed to know. It was the kind of silence that seeps into your bones and stays there, a quiet reminder that the people who should have held you close had chosen to turn away. And that was the moment something inside me stopped reaching for them. When I stepped outside that night, the air hit me like a wave I didn't see coming, cool and sharp, carrying that quiet stillness that makes every sound around you louder than it really is. I walked down the familiar path leading to my house, the same path I've walked for years, and with each step, the laughter I left behind seemed to follow me, echoing faintly in my mind like a song I didn't want to hear. My shoes pressed softly against the gravel, and I could feel my hands curling inside my cardigan, as if I could hold myself together with just a little more strength. The night was calm, but inside me it wasn't calm at all. Something kept unraveling, slowly, quietly, the way a thread slips loose when no one is looking. I thought about all the nights I had walked that same road after working late, rushing home with tired legs but a full heart, excited to be greeted with love that once felt real. I thought about how many times I had carried groceries with numb fingers, just so they wouldn't have to worry about anything. And now, here I was, walking the same road, but carrying nothing except the weight of a silence I didn't deserve. It felt heavy in a way no bag ever did. It wasn't just the laughter that hurt. It was how easily it left their lips, like kindness had been replaced with mockery, and I was the only one who didn't see it coming. I didn't cry, not even when the cold crept into my bones. My tears had long been spent on moments that were supposed to mean something, and now I had none left to give to people who found joy in my pain. I held my head up, not because I was unaffected, but because some pains deserve silence, not begging. I let the wind brush across my face, and for the first time in a long while, I stopped pretending that everything would fix itself. I understood then that love, when it isn't respected, can turn into a knife that cuts quietly and deep. When I reached my door, I paused before going in, standing under the faint porch light, listening to nothing but my own heartbeat. The night didn't care what had happened at that table. It didn't care who was laughing or who was walking away. But it was honest, and it held me without asking for anything in return. That small stillness felt more like home than the table I had just left. And in that quiet moment, I knew something had changed. I wasn't the same woman who sat smiling through their laughter. Something in me had closed, not with bitterness, but with finality. I was done waiting for their kindness to return. When I stepped inside my house that night, the warmth wrapped around me like an old blanket that remembered everything I had ever been through. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything from you, just holds you in its arms and lets you breathe. I walked to the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had cooked countless meals for the people who laughed at me just a few hours earlier. My hands moved across the counter, touching the familiar grooves in the wood, and for a moment I remembered the early years when love still lived in this home, when every meal felt like a promise that we were building something together. I used to believe those moments would last forever, that love would be enough to hold everything steady. But love without respect fades, and when it fades, it takes more than warmth with it. I sat down at the table, the one I bought with money I earned from years of hard work, the one that had held both celebrations and quiet nights of worry. I thought about every sacrifice I had made over the years, the overtime hours, the aching hands, the days when I went without just to make sure no one else had to. I remembered the nights I came home exhausted, still cooking, still smiling, because I believed giving was what kept us close. Every small gesture was built on love, not obligation, and I had never once asked for repayment. I gave because I wanted to. Because seeing them live comfortably made the weight on my shoulders feel worth it. But sitting there alone that night, I finally admitted to myself that the people I gave everything to had stopped seeing me a long time ago. The laughter at that dinner table wasn't just about a reunion. It was about how easily they could erase me from a space I helped build. It wasn't a single moment of cruelty. It was the reflection of many small cracks that I had chosen to ignore because I thought love could fix them. I saw it clearly now. The years of giving had built a bridge they had long stopped walking across. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting on the table that held my history, and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't rage or bitterness. It was a quiet understanding. I had spent a lifetime holding everyone else together, but no one had thought to hold me. I realized then that the strength I had given away so freely could now be mine to keep. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life where my worth wasn't decided by how much I gave to people who never gave back. That thought didn't hurt. It felt calm, steady, like the start of something I should have done a long time ago. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I couldn't sleep, but because my heart felt strangely clear, like a fog had finally lifted after years of pretending it wasn't there. The house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts without interruption, and for once, they didn't feel heavy. I made myself a cup of tea, sat down at the table, and stared out the window at the soft light touching the yard. I had spent so many years giving everything I had to keep others comfortable that I had forgotten how it felt to simply choose myself. But that morning, it wasn't a question anymore. It was a decision already made in the silence of the night before. I thought about the money I had set aside, the way I had been helping my daughter month after month, always believing it was going towards something good, something meaningful. I told myself it was for the children, for their future, for their comfort, and maybe in the beginning it was. But over time, the gratitude disappeared, replaced by expectation, like kindness had turned into a bill I was obligated to keep paying. I had ignored the small signs, the clipped tones, the way my generosity had become invisible. But that laughter at the dinner table showed me what I had truly become in their eyes, a hand that gave, not a heart that mattered. I pushed my chair back slowly and walked toward the small desk in the corner where all my paperwork rested. Those folders had been sitting there for years, carefully organized, untouched, except when needed, because I've always been someone who plans ahead. I opened them one by one, feeling the weight of each page, the numbers I had worked hard to save, the trust I had quietly placed in others. And right there, without a second thought, I began to make changes. I removed access, updated authorizations, shifted what needed to be shifted, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I wasn't shutting doors out of anger, I was closing them to protect what I built. As my pen moved across the paper and my fingers clicked through each step, there was no trembling in my hands. There was only calm. A kind of calm I hadn't felt in a very long time. It felt like gathering back every piece of myself I had given away. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood my own worth. I didn't owe anyone my silence anymore. I didn't owe anyone my savings. I didn't owe anyone the right to treat me like I was less than family. And when I closed that final folder and leaned back in my chair, it felt like the first breath of fresh air after years of holding it in. I wasn't waiting for anyone to change. I was changing the story myself. 4 days later, I was sitting in my living room with the afternoon light spilling through the curtains when my phone buzzed on the table. At first, I didn't think much of it. I've gotten used to silence from her, so a message was never something I expected. But then another buzz came, then a third, and something in me already knew. I picked up the phone slowly, and there it was. The bank alert flashing across the screen, cold and clear, the way only numbers can be. She had tried to take out $2,700, the same amount she had grown accustomed to receiving, without ever needing to ask. But this time, it didn't go through. I stared at that message for a long moment, and then a quiet smile found its way to my face. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel fear. What I felt was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. I opened the message thread, and before she could even reach out, I sent her a screenshot of the failed transaction. I didn't add a long explanation. I didn't try to justify or soften anything. I typed the words slowly, carefully, letting each one land exactly as it should. Payment denied, must be that family-only policy. I sent it without hesitation, and then I put the phone back down, my hands steady. My heart steady too. For years, I had given without asking for anything in return. And in a single moment, I had taken back what should have always been mine to control. I sat there in that chair, listening to the house breathe around me, and for once, it didn't feel empty. It felt strong. I could already imagine the storm of messages that would follow, the confusion, the anger, the sudden realization that I was no longer going to play the role they had written for me. But I wasn't worried about any of it. I had learned that silence, when it comes from strength, can be louder than any shouting match. As I sat there with my tea cooling on the table, I let that moment sink deep into my chest. This wasn't about money, it never really was. This was about respect, about dignity, about showing that I was no longer going to let them laugh at me while taking everything I worked for. I had carried them for so long, they forgot I had hands that could let go. And now, I had. And that silence after sending that message, that stillness that filled the room, felt like a small piece of my power finding its way back home to me. Not long after I sent that message, the silence I had been wrapped in slowly began to shift. The first call came through within minutes, then another, and then the messages began to pile up, one after another, filling the screen with her confusion and anger. I didn't answer a single one. I just sat there, letting each sound fade into the walls, letting the house stay calm while the storm raged through the phone. I read the first message, then the second, and every word confirmed what I already knew deep inside. It was never love she saw when she looked at what I gave. It was access. Something she felt entitled to. Something she thought would never end. Her words were sharp, wrapped in panic, trying to make me feel guilty for a line I should have drawn a long time ago. But I didn't bend this time. I didn't even flinch. The group chat that had once been full of pictures and kind words turned sour quickly, filled with questions that weren't really questions, just accusations dressed up as concern. Some tried to soften it, pretending to mediate, but I knew their silence at that dinner table spoke louder than anything they could type now. They had laughed too. They had let it happen. And now that the money had stopped flowing, suddenly they found their voices again. But I wasn't listening anymore. I didn't need to. I had already said everything I needed to in that one message. And I wasn't going to waste another breath on explanations for people who never cared to listen when it mattered. I placed the phone face down on the table, letting their anger bounce off the quiet walls of my home. And in that silence, I felt something settle deeper inside me. It wasn't coldness. It was strength, the kind that doesn't shout or demand, the kind that simply stands its ground. I had spent so many years being the one who reached out first, the one who softened the edges, the one who fixed what others broke. But not anymore. This time I was letting the silence speak for me, because silence, when it comes from a steady heart, says everything that words can't. The night crept in slowly, and the messages kept coming, like waves hitting a rock that would not move. I sat by the window, watching the dark stretch across the yard, and I realized how strange it felt to not feel guilty. All my life I'd carried the weight of making peace, of making sure everyone else was comfortable, even at my own expense. But now there was no guilt left in me to give. Only a calm certainty that I had finally chosen myself. I didn't need to reply. I didn't need to explain. I had closed a door that should have never been left open for people who didn't value the hands that built it. 2 days later, the house was wrapped in a stillness that felt almost too calm, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break it. I had grown used to the silence, to the way the air settled softly around me, but that morning it felt different, heavier, as if it knew what was coming. I was sitting by the window with a cup of tea resting in my hands when it happened. A loud knock slammed against the door, sharp and desperate, echoing through the hallway like a sound that didn't belong in my quiet home. It wasn't the kind of knock that came from someone visiting, it was the kind that demanded to be heard. For a long moment, I didn't move. I let the sound hang in the air, letting it lose its power before I even thought about standing up. I looked around my living room, at the photos on the wall, at the life I had built piece by piece, and I realized something very simple. This was my house. My walls, my door. And for the first time, I didn't feel small in my own space. Another knock came, louder this time, a voice pushing through the wood, calling my name in a tone thick with frustration. I heard the edge in her voice, that mix of anger and desperation, the sound of someone realizing that the control they thought they had no longer existed. I stood up slowly, not rushing for anyone, and walked toward the door with steps that felt steady, grounded, like the floor itself was holding me up. I stopped just behind the door, listening to the silence between each knock, hearing her breathing heavy on the other side. I could have opened it right away. I could have rushed like I used to whenever she needed something. But those days were gone. I let her knock again, and this time, it didn't shake me. It didn't hurt me. It didn't make me question myself. It was just noise. I rested my hand on the door frame, feeling the solid wood beneath my fingers, and I realized how much strength lived in this quiet moment. I wasn't the woman they laughed at around that dinner table anymore. I wasn't the woman who bent every time someone needed her to. I was standing where I belonged, in a home I built, holding on to the dignity I had carried all along. And for the first time in a long time, I felt no need to rush. No need to explain, no need to fold myself smaller to make someone else feel bigger. The knocking grew louder, but I stood there calm, letting the sound echo against walls that would no longer shelter people who didn't respect them. When I finally turned the handle and opened the door, I did it slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted every second to remind her that this door opened when I decided, not when she demanded. The moment the door swung open, her face was the first thing I saw, flushed with anger, frustration tangled in every line of it. Her eyes weren't soft or kind, they were sharp, as if she couldn't believe I had the nerve to stand in front of her and not bend. She started speaking before I could even take a breath, her voice loud, rushed, accusing. She asked why I would do this, how I could do this to her. How could I just take away something she had gotten so used to? Every word came out like a stone thrown at a wall, but nothing she said cracked me. Not anymore. I leaned against the doorframe, not defensively but calmly, the way someone does when they have nothing to prove. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain myself, because explanations were for people who cared to listen, and she had stopped listening a long time ago. I looked at her face as she kept talking, and all I saw was someone who believed love was a bottomless well she could drink from forever without ever thinking of how it was filled. Her words were full of entitlement, not understanding. It wasn't about love. It was about what she felt she had lost. When she finally paused, waiting for me to defend myself, I said the only thing that needed to be said. I reminded her of her own words at that dinner table. The way she laughed, the way everyone laughed with her. I told her I didn't do anything to her that she hadn't already done to me, that she was the one who closed that door long before I ever locked it. I didn't say it to hurt her. I said it because it was the truth, and for once I wasn't going to protect her from it. Her mouth opened like she wanted to fight it, But the silence between us was louder than anything she could say. Standing there, with the door half open and the cool air brushing between us, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't afraid of losing her, because in a way, I had already lost her long before that night. And that quiet realization didn't break me. It freed me. I didn't need her to understand the pain she caused. And I didn't need her to see me differently. I only needed her to know that I was done being the woman they could laugh at and still depend on the next morning. That version of me no longer lived here. This time the silence was mine, and it was stronger than anything she could shout at me. I stepped out just a little, letting the door stay open behind me, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the one who had to shrink to make her feel big. I stood there on my porch, looking at her straight in the eyes, and I let every piece of calm inside me speak louder than any raised voice ever could. She tried to talk again, softer this time, as if pulling on the same old strings that once made me give in, but those strings were no longer tied to me. I told her, with a voice steady enough to make even the wind pause, that everything she had once relied on from me was mine, built from my own hands, my own sacrifices, and my own years of work. I reminded her that nothing she had ever taken from me was owed. It was given out of love, and love is not something to be laughed at, mocked, or treated like an endless purse waiting to be opened. She stood there speechless, and for a brief second, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't anger but realization. The kind that comes too late, when the door has already started to close. I told her I had spent a lifetime giving everything to the people I loved, but love without respect is like pouring water into a cracked cup. No matter how much you give, it will never stay full. I told her I had no more to give, not because I was bitter, but because I had finally learned that my heart deserved to be protected too. Every dollar, every ounce of energy, every quiet night spent worrying while they slept, all of it was mine, and from that moment on, it would remain with me. She began to reach for excuses, trying to stitch together something that sounded like remorse, but her words were clumsy and thin, falling apart before they even left her mouth. I didn't let her finish. I told her gently that respect isn't something you get to pick up only when it benefits you. You either hold it always or lose what comes with it. And with that, I took a single step back, letting the doorframe rest against my hand. I could feel the wood warm beneath my palm, solid, steady, like it had been waiting for me to finally take my place again. As she stood there, her face shifting from anger to silence, I knew she finally understood that the woman standing in front of her wasn't the same one who stayed quiet at the table while they laughed. This woman had found her strength in that silence. She had found her worth in the stillness of an empty house that held more honesty than a room full of people who only showed up with open hands. And when I slowly began to close the door, I didn't feel pain. I felt something far greater. Peace. A kind of peace that didn't ask for permission. A kind of peace that belonged only to me. When the door finally clicked shut, the silence that followed didn't feel heavy or lonely. It felt warm, like the kind of quiet that belongs to someone who has finally taken their power back. I leaned against the wood, letting the weight of years I had carried for others slowly lift off my shoulders. For so long, I thought love meant giving endlessly, even when it hurt. But that night proved that love without respect is nothing but an empty echo. I walked back to my chair, the one that has held me through laughter and tears, and I sat down knowing that this time I didn't lose anything. I simply stopped handing pieces of myself to people who never deserved them in the first place. I looked around my home, the walls I built, the life I held together, and I realized I wasn't standing in a place of loss. I was standing in a place of strength. My silence wasn't weakness, it was dignity. And dignity, once claimed, doesn't ask to be returned. It stays, it stands, it protects. So I breathed, steady and calm, letting the stillness carry me into a kind of peace I had waited too many years to feel. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of my story. It truly means more than I can say. If this touched your heart in any way, I'd love to know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so we can share more moments like this together.